Host for this podcast. We are excited to bring you some amazing information about people living with bleeding disorders, navigating chronic illness, and we hope that you enjoy this podcast. Welcome to the Hope Charities Podcast. It is great to be with you today. If you're listening in for the first time, it is a real treat to be able to come to you today to talk to you about a lot of things that pertain to chronic illness and rare disease and a vast majority of different topics that pertain to that. But today we have a really special treat to be able to talk a little bit about mental health and specifically to address some of the concerns as it pertains to depression, anxiety, and ultimately even suicide and suicide intervention. And I have invited two amazing guests to join me today on the show. It's been a real treat to sit with many of you who know our very own Lori Bienvenu, who is a licensed counselor, but also has a deep background in suicide intervention training. Was an executive director of a nonprofit that helped with that type of field for a long time. And now is on the staff at Hope and does a lot of sessions around mental health and everything. So, Lori, it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Jonathan.
And then my second guest is Emma Benoit, who is joined us today to talk a lot about her journey and her personal story of overcoming suicide. I'm going to say it that way. That might not be the best way to say it, but it really is truly a story of overcoming some really tragedy and trauma. And man, it takes a tremendous amount of courage to be able to do what you do. So thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today, Emma.
Hi, it's my pleasure to be here with you and to share my story in this way.
Great. Well, tell us a little bit about where you're from, and we'll start out with you and talk a little bit about where you're from and what you're doing these days.
So I was born in Thibodaux, but was raised in Ascension Parish. I grew up right down the street from Dutchtown High. I went to Dutchtown Elementary, Middle, and then High. Graduated in 2018. And now I am a mental health advocate, and specifically suicide prevention is where I like to focus my energy into. Yeah,
that's amazing. Well, I know that you have a deep story, and we'll kind of dive into this a little bit later. But you even have a documentary that's coming out about your journey and about your experiences. And one of the things that I find with anyone who advocates for any rare, if it's a rare disease, if it's a chronic illness, if it's anything that you're passionate about, that you're advocating for. I find it just takes a lot of bravery to do that. And so I'm excited to dive into your story because I look at someone who has overcome a lot and a whole lot. And but to be able to talk about it and to be able to kind of dive into that is really important. One of the things that's really critical, I think, for our audience and for what we do as an organization is we deal with a lot of people that are living with invisible disease. And so there's a lot of times things that are going on inside that we can't always articulate externally. And I find that is exactly the same when you're dealing with anxiety, depression, and as we do the work we do as it pertains to mental health. And so tell me a little bit about your journey and really what got you to this point.
So growing up, I was very charismatic, spunky. I have one older brother whom I've always been very close with. I think I can actually count on one hand how many times we've argued in our life, which sounds unrealistic, but I promise my mom and dad can vouch. So growing up, we were attached to the hip, and my parents were very supportive, and I grew up kind of what I like to call in a bubble. There was really nothing for me to worry about as a kid or stress about or anything like that. But when I got into elementary school, I really started to deal with insecurity and self-image issues. And, going forward throughout life, those feelings of not being good enough, not being worthy, just kind of carried through as I got older. And so I did experience bullying in middle school. And, I went through a couple of experiences in middle school with bullying and, things like that. And really the biggest thing for me, though, was I never wanted anyone to think that I was weak. I never wanted anyone to see me in a different way than what I thought everyone portrayed me to be. Mm-hmm. And so because I had these insecurities and these emotions, these feelings of not being good enough, or really what I know now is anxiety, I just masked it and I suppressed it because, like I said, I didn't want anyone to know that I was struggling in that way. And so going on through, middle school and then into high school, peer pressure and all the things that, come naturally for high school students really affected me. And I could never put things into perspective long enough to really understand the value of patience. And I just always felt very lost and inferior to my peers, and like I didn't have a sense of direction. And, dealing with all of those negative emotions and feelings as a young kid and never even really understanding them, therefore never feeling comfortable sharing them with anyone, really put me in a really dark place, a really hopeless place. And I was really suffering pretty badly in high school. I really didn't even understand how bad I was struggling until I was invited on a trip to New York City. It was the summer before my senior year of high school. I was invited on that trip, and really all of my joy had just returned. And I really realized the cloud of depression that I had been living under, because I got to experience how good life could be versus what I had been living back at home. And so I would say that coming home from that trip really shined light on things that I otherwise would not have really realized. And, I was just in a really dark place when I came home from that trip, and ultimately led me to attempting suicide when I was 16 years old. And, not ever uttering a word of what I was feeling, or not ever letting anyone in my life know that I was hurting in such a heavy way, really put me in a position of feeling hopeless, because I felt like if I opened up now, if I shared what I had been feeling, no one was going to believe me. No one would really even care to listen enough to, hear me and hear what I have to say and validate what I'm going through. So I just felt really hopeless and lost, and I felt like, everything that I was feeling would have burdened my mom and dad, who I would have gone to. And so, all of those factors culminated into me attempting suicide. And that has kind of been the foreground for this journey that I'm on currently. And so we'll get into it a little more as the conversation progresses. But surviving that suicide attempt really showed me so many things about myself, about life, about other people. And just I really had kind of a wake-up call after surviving something that, by man's definition is fatal.
Wow. I have so many questions just as we're talking about this process about what life was like. You mentioned that, one, how old were you when you attempted?
I was 16.
16, wow. And so, you mentioned kind of before that you didn't have a lot of, for all intents and purposes, life seemed fairly normal. Like you shouldn't really had a lot of reasons to struggle, but you were struggling internally a lot. And so, tell me about that. Like, what was that like? Were you born with? I mean, I know for a lot of people that are watching, maybe thinking like, did you have some sort of prior condition or some sort of undiagnosed something that you were struggling with? Was there anything like that you know of that was causing some of the tension?
Yeah. So my knowledge and my exposure to what mental health really looked like and what it was very minimal. I had honestly never heard the words mental and health used together before I attempted.
Wow.
So this thought of someone suffering with their mental health was not even something that was considered. So I was experiencing what I now know as anxiety and depression, but I never associated those words with what I was experiencing because that lack of knowledge was present. And growing up in the environment and kind of, I get overall the environment that I grew up in essentially kind of hindered me from really being honest with myself as to how real my problems were, because I felt like externally my life was perfect, right? And so I never felt justified in what I was feeling or experiencing. And so because of that, because I had, my parents were happily married, I had just gotten a brand new car when I turned 16, I was on the varsity cheerleading squad, had popularity, I was very well liked, and all those factors really kind of hindered me from feeling justified in what I was actually experiencing. And so in turn, I never even really thought to reach out for help because I never thought that my problems were important enough to be heard. So I was definitely doing a lot of self-invalidation in those days, and really had begun to formulate a thought pattern of just self-deprecation. And anytime those feelings of stress or depression or anxiety would arise, I would immediately shut them down by telling myself, suck it up, look how good your life is, it could always be worse, there are people out there who have it worse than you. And all of those, statements that I would say to myself really just hindered me and continued to compound what I was experiencing. And so, like I said, growing up, no one really talked about mental health the way that we're talking about it now. And so for me, experiencing those things, I didn't feel like I really had a place to come forward and say, hey, I'm hurting, I'm sad.
So tell me about that in the process of the timeline. Like you had gone on this trip, you were doing basically some modeling opportunities that you had, and you were gone to New York and kind of living this one image of what life should look like. And for all intents and purposes, it's opportunity. There should be hope attached to it. It should be excitement and thrilling. But then you come home and it's kind of like back to reality, right? And that played a big role in really you attempting ultimately, right?
Yeah, definitely. So to give some context as to where I was in life during that time, my entire life I had been a cheerleader. That's the only sport I've ever done. It's the only one that I've ever desired and loved. And when I began cheerleading, I really grew a real intense passion for it. And cheerleading was my life. And the summer before my senior year, I decided to forego the squad. I didn't try out for my senior year on the squad. And that, knowing what I know now, was definitely a sign. So I was in a position where I wasn't involved with my team. I wasn't having to be at practice. I was home alone during the summertime, and I was depressed. And no one knew that. I really didn't even know that. I just knew that I was really in a dark place and could not ever see a light at the end of the tunnel. And so I was invited to attend a trip in New York City. It was a modeling trip for a local photographer. And so getting that opportunity really was a huge boost for my confidence and something that I really needed. Because one of the reasons why I did give up cheerleading was because I didn't feel good enough. I felt like the new girls coming in were better than me. They were more deserving than me. And I just felt like they didn't need me anymore. And so getting that opportunity to be a part of that trip was really huge for me. It was a real big confidence boost. And there were 8 girls on that trip, and some of whom I had never met before. So I didn't feel the need to protect this image that I had been working so hard for so many years to protect. This untouchable, overachieving, perfect person that can have nothing happen in her life that will affect her. And so I really, like I said, didn't feel the need to maintain that image because some of those girls I had never met before and they were new faces. So I could just be myself. And I really, like I said, found my joy again. I really found, that Emma that existed when I was a kid. And she came back, and it was so good in that it did give me the confidence boost that I needed at the time, but it was equally as damaging because coming home from that trip, and having circumstances at home that were not, good for me. I was in trouble with my mom and dad, and all these things were, present in my life during that time. And coming home from that extreme high of life back down to my reality it just hit me like a ton of bricks. And I really fully, like I said, realized how bad I was struggling and that I was under a cloud of depression at home. And so ultimately, all of those feelings culminated and, I began to tell myself these lies, and the suicidal ideation really turned into suicidal, thoughts and active suicidal thinking. And it was in the matter of those 3 days that my thoughts went from suicidal ideation type of thinking to active suicidal thinking.
Taking action, yeah. Tell me about, one of the things that I think we've learned in some of the assist training and some of the other things that we've done. I know you're a Living Works advocate, or ambassador, I should say. But in a lot of those things we talk about, reaching out for help. Was there ever a time where you felt like you reached out for help?
Not consciously. I know subconsciously I was trying to reach out for help.
Yeah, like
I would
looking back as 2020, right? You can always see that, right?
Yeah, but I definitely was, putting out little cries for help here and there. But I will say that I would say about 4 days prior to my attempt, I had thought about reaching out and letting someone know that I had these thoughts. But immediately, because of, I guess, the environment I was raised in, what I believed to be true, I really fully believed in the stigma. I did. I thought that there's no reason or no right for me to feel this way because look at my life. And so when that thought did cross my mind of seeking help and letting someone in, I immediately shut that thought down by telling myself, leave that for people who have real problems. There are people out there who need therapy more than you.
Wow.
And so that was kind of the state of mind that I was in, and it was really challenging for me to overcome that type of thinking because I had been thinking like that for years, and I was in such a state of invalidation and denial.
We talk a lot about how, I think it's important that you talk to yourself. The voice inside of inside of your own head is so important that sometimes we would talk to ourselves more negatively than we would even a stranger on the street. And I know one of the things we talked about this at our Hope conference this past year about how important it is that you're kind to yourself and your own thoughts. And it sounds like to me that you're like really hard on yourself, and probably that competitive nature, just was part of what made you great in some of those aspects, but it probably also was detrimental in some of your own, your own aspects. I think one of the reasons why we talk so much about, reaching out for help, reaching out for your resources, getting out there and raising a hand and saying, I need help, is because exactly what you experience. Like, there's so many people that don't even know to take that action. They don't even think to take that action before they're taking, their life in their own hands. And so, it's interesting in your case. I know the research that Lori, that you shared with us last year through the assist training was showing that there's the gross majority of people who do reach out to a friend before they reach out to a professional per se, right?
Right, absolutely. Well, and in this case, I'm wondering what could have happened, what could have been if someone had come to you and said, "Are you okay?"
Yeah.
What would that have done for you?
Honestly, they would have had to dig deeper because I was asked, "Are you okay? Is everything okay?" But because I wanted to protect this image, and I never wanted anyone to see me as weak because of what my perspective of mental health and what it looks like was. I don't think that by simply asking me if I was okay would have really done much. However, if they would have alluded to some of my behaviors or maybe brought up some of the changes in my character, that would have struck a chord with me. Because for me, I'm rooted in this way. I'm a people pleaser, and I always want to make people proud and make them happy and make them feel good. And so if someone would have asked me, well, you've been in your room more often. Are you sure you're okay? Or, is there a reason that you're not sharing with us that you didn't try out for cheer? Or if they had maybe have framed it in that way, then maybe it would have struck a chord. I think it would have. But yeah.
And that's one of the things that I always talk about when I do suicide. When I talk about suicide intervention, I tell people, make it personal. You've not been yourself. You seem sad. You haven't tried out for cheerleading. Are you thinking of suicide? Are you going through depression? Is there, you just have to, I'm not going to say it's going to work for every person, but it sounds like in this case, it might have been effective.
I think it might have. It definitely could have. It's plausible to think that for sure.
This brings up an interesting point because that was one of the things that was probably the most striking to me during your training that you did with us on last year was that I think there is, you talk about stigmas, there is a mindset I think among general public that is like, if I bring up, are you having suicidal thoughts? Like just by saying that, I'm giving them the idea. But you illustrated very clearly that actually the research shows that that's not what happens, right?
Right, absolutely. Yeah, it's better to be direct because it's something it's a problem you're facing directly. It's something that we need to be comfortable addressing directly. Did you want to
Yeah, I mean, I think that the word suicide was always a frightening word for me growing up because what is depicted in the media and on television and what is portrayed to the public people of what suicide really is, and growing up in small town Louisiana, my mom and dad were raised Catholic, and it was taught that it's a mortal sin to commit suicide. And even that language, commit suicide, right? We're alluding to the fact that it's a crime, which it's not. And so that whole understanding and, like I said, knowledge of what it really was so minimal for me. And like I said, I really did associate just the word suicide with like bad. I just thought that I'm having these thoughts. They're bad thoughts. I'm never going to tell anyone that I'm having these thoughts because they're going to think I'm like a bad person.
Right. But if someone else, like a trusted friend, would have crossed that barrier for you and said, "Are you having suicidal thoughts?" it at least would have presented you with the idea and the opportunity to maybe say, it's easier sometimes to say yes than to say, "I'm having suicidal thoughts." Like that is almost two drastically different responses, right?
Totally. I think that if the word would have been put on the table for me, I would have definitely opened up.
Right.
If someone would have said, "Are you having suicidal thoughts? Are you thinking of taking your life?" That would have struck a chord, and I would have immediately admitted because that was one of the biggest holdups for me was the word.
Right.
So had someone maybe presented it in a way that's just direct, it could have made a difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's so funny how our perspectives can be our best friends and they can be our worst enemies. I heard you say earlier that you thought my struggles just they're not significant enough. That's not justification for me to feel the way that I feel. And I think about how many times I thought my son has hemophilia. And I thought, you find yourself feeling sorry for yourself and you think, there's so many people have it so much worse, right? That's the language you used. And for me, that's, for the most part, that's a good perspective to have because it fills me with gratitude. But for some people, and I mean, what's more different from, hemophilia and mental illness? They look absolutely nothing alike, right? But on the inside, sometimes they're the same thing. And the struggle is, sometimes the same thing. And I like having that perspective of, Jonathan's situation is way worse than anything my son will probably ever experience. But I don't want that to ever be something that devalues my experience.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think that's part of the stigma that you talked about is that, it's our perspective. It's the perspectives that are, shown onto us from the outside world, and they all kind of come together and they can be helpful and they can be hurtful.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to understand that every individual in life is going to have a different experience, right? Because we all have different brains. We all process things differently. We all see things differently. So what's really helped me to negate that type of thinking after I attempted has really been to just understand that everybody experiences things differently. And, there is no grounds for comparison in terms of someone's experience in life. There just is not, because how can you sit there and compare my struggles to someone who lives halfway across the world from me, right? And that's what I was doing. I would say, well, I'm feeling really heartbroken because I've been ignored by my best friend all day, but there are people out there who can't eat tonight. And so I would be on that crazy spectrum of comparison that really has no grounds for comparison.
Yeah.
And that's the type of thinking that I was living in.
Yeah. It's striking to me too that you have this, devalue. We see this a lot of times in the hemophilia community specifically, where people are diagnosed with maybe mild or severe, and there's this whole stigma in the community that's like, well, my needs aren't as bad as your needs. My daughter, for instance, has mild hemophilia, and she has been, kind of has lived under that guise of, I'm not as good, as, and we know tons and tons of people who've gone through that where it's like, it's not as much. We've talked a lot about how, I think I have hopes for some day where we get rid of that mild, moderate, severe language where we're just talking about like, you either, have this or you don't have that and don't, but comes back to comparison ultimately is if we have this, and look, with social media and everything the way it is today, comparison is worse than I think it's ever been.
Agreed.
But I do believe that that no matter what it is that you're going through, it's easy for you to shut things down just to survive. I think it's a component of our survival instincts. But I do believe that like you just being able to say, no, I'm being honest with this is just the way that I feel, right, wrong, or indifferent. It may not be that you have maybe it is small to some other person, but to you it's big. And that's important for you to first, what is it, part of the 12 steps programs is like they all say like one of the first steps is just acknowledgement, is just being able to say this is where I'm at. And so you cannot move forward unless you acknowledge that, right?
Totally. And I think that that's been something that I've come to learn throughout this journey is that I really wasn't doing myself any favors by denying what I was experiencing. It is totally, the individual's, I don't want to say job or duty, but, they're almost their responsibility to acknowledge what they're experiencing. Because, it's one thing to be aware of the resources and the help that's out there, but it's a whole nother ball game to fully be in the understanding yourself and say, no, I need to reach out for help, and this is what I'm experiencing. So
That's true. Yeah, we face that with joint disease and inflammation and all kinds of things where it's like, just call the doctor and just say, hey, look, I had an experience where I tore my MCL recently, and it was like a minor thing, and my wife was like, the whole time, Carla was like, would you just call the doctor and tell him? I'm like, it's probably not a big deal, and I'm limping around for like 3 weeks going, and she's like, no, really, would you please just, and so I'm growing, I'm learning, and so I'm trying to listen to my wife and be a more mature human, and so I did. I called the doctor, and the doctor was like, no, you're fine. You'll just, go home, you pansy. No, I'm just kidding. She didn't say that at all. No, that's what I was telling myself in my head, though. This is a good because in my mind, I'm thinking I'm going to call them and they're literally going to make fun of me. And they didn't. Matter of fact, the doctors jumped into action. They were like, get down here right now. Let's do an ultrasound. And they did. And they were like, oh my gosh, you probably need to see an orthopedist. But in my head, part of my apprehension to making the phone call to the professional was that I might be made fun of. And that has never happened in my whole life. They've never made fun of me. But you know what I'm saying? That was my own harshness to myself that was preventing me from raising my hand and saying, I'm not sure if I need help, but I might need help.
Yeah. Yeah, man, that's funny that you mentioned that story because I actually just a couple of minutes ago I was at my mom's office and I was needing that out external voice to say no, Emma, what you're going through is valid in its own right. And it is a you have to, it's not something that you're just going to snap your fingers and then know how to do for yourself.
Right.
Right. It takes time and practice to kind of rewire your brain in a way that you don't speak to yourself in that way.
And its own type of courage.
Yeah.
Like I mean, I'm thinking you have courage about the big things in life, but sometimes you don't think those little decision points in your brain are. But if you can have bravery in that to step out and say and speak up and say, I'm not sure even how to sort through this on my own, but this is what I'm thinking. I might need help here because this is where my head's at. It is important, and I think that's true. I think sometimes we relegate that to be either external processors or internal processors. I mean, I have both living in my home. I have 4 teenagers and, we've got internals and externals going on here. And in both cases, I can see that they need to externally process, even if they're introverts by nature, And so it's like, how do we make that? I do believe part of the solution to mental health and to us and to seeing people thrive when they're suffering, part of that is just normalizing the stigma. It's normalizing the conversation and say, hey, and I love this, cross the line and just say the big thing you're fearful of. Are you having suicidal thoughts? I mean, that's part of the assist training. It's like, are you thinking about suicide? Like just crossing that line. And it's hard to sometimes let those words come out of your mouth as the helper.
It's the scariest part.
Yeah.
Because you don't know what's coming.
Right.
You really don't. My husband said this one time. I was going through a tough spot and he was worried about me and he said, are you thinking of suicide? And I said, no, but I'm so glad you asked. And what would you have done if I would have said yes? And he's like, I have no idea. I would have asked you what I needed to do next, because he had no idea. But for him, the thought of me being in that situation was scarier than him not asking. Yeah. And I absolutely loved that. I love that he was willing to put himself on the line like that. But as far as, what you were saying about being an internal versus an external processor, I think there's 2 things that has to happen when it comes to mental health or even physical health. One is just self-awareness, and the other one is self-validation, both of which you talked about. And it sounds so simple. We just have to pay attention to ourselves, and we have to respect who we are, where we're at. It's 2 simple words, but 2 huge things to do.
So true.
I don't know why that's so difficult, but I think everybody struggles with that. One or both of those. at some point in their lives. But
Well, we talked about this the other day about we had some conversations before this interview about like what we were going to talk about. And one of the things that kind of came up for me was that I think everyone, if we were really honest with ourselves, I think every human being at some point has had some type of thought that was like, what if I just ceased to exist? What if I wasn't here? Like, what if I just, and it may be very, very, very minuscule, but I mean, how many times I know, at least for me, I think I've probably had more than the average Joe of those thoughts, but where it's like, I've been driving down the road and I just think like, what if I just steer this thing into the ditch, and that is, may not be like the big ugly, like I'm actually doing something tangible to take action on this. But if we were really honest, I think everyone has had that kind of thought before, right?
well, and that's the beginning of I need to reach out.
Right.
That's when you go for help, right?
Right.
And it's so much easier then. It's less scary because you're not having to say I want to kill myself. You're just saying I'm having a hard time and I need to talk about this.
Right.
I need somebody to process this with.
Yes.
That's when that we talk about mental health self-care, mental health prophy is my term for it. We talk about that all the time, and that's what it is. It's right there. It's in that moment where you're not, the horrible things are not about to happen. It's you're still in a relatively safe space.
Right. And it's got to be a trusted individual, right? It's got to be somebody that you trust.
Absolutely.
It's interesting that you mentioned that same thought, because I've had that same thought as well. And, knowing what I know now, that is suicidal ideation type thinking. And I was thinking things like that for about, a year prior to my attempt, I would say. I would have those thoughts occur, just going about my day to day. And something that I think is, something that I've learned is that mental health is on a spectrum. And it really is, because I feel like I would have a great day one day and I'd be on cloud nine, happy, and just nothing was wrong. And then the next day I was at rock bottom and everything was wrong. And I could not pull myself out of the thought of not wanting to be alive anymore. And so, having those two extremes for me as a teenager was really damaging, because I would think, well, you were fine yesterday. Why do you feel this way today? Shame on you. And then again comes in with the invalidation and the self-deprecation type of thinking. And, knowing what I know now, I'm able to nip those thoughts in the bud when they first come up. I utilize what my therapist has taught me as evidence-based thinking, and I challenge my thoughts. And because it's interesting, but your brain can actually lie to you. The critical judge in your head doesn't always tell you the truth. And I found that out very quickly after surviving my suicide attempt, because I was telling myself all these things and then openly telling them to my therapist, and she's like, wait, what? That's not true. Like, what is your, that's a lie. And I'm like, well, it's not a lie because I believe it. And she's like, no, it's a lie. And your brain is telling you that. And so it's really interesting once you get into your own head essentially and try to control your own thoughts, you really do, at least from my experience, you really do see a difference in the way you feel.
It's interesting too, because I think in society today, we have, started to adopt this idea of relative truth, where it's like, well, you have your truth and I have my truth and you have your truth. And it's like, there's a limit to that thinking. Like, there really is absolute truths, and there really is, things that, like you said, you can be misled by your own thoughts sometimes. But and really, it's not that. I think it has to do more for perception's sake than it is really that they're incorrect. Right. I think sometimes you can have something that's factually true in an ideation, but it may actually be that you're seeing it from the wrong perspective that makes it wrong for you.
Definitely. That's very true. And I think that, growing up and the thoughts that I was having, my perception was totally warped. I had this false idea of what reality was, partly because of social media, because that definitely was a factor into my suicide attempt. I was constantly comparing myself to other girls on the internet and, what my peers had and what I didn't have. And I always felt inferior. I really did. I always felt like I would never be able to level up or measure up to my peers and my friends. And that made me feel inferior and lost because, you know, I felt like I had no direction because, you know, in school, particularly high school, all that's really talked about is college and careers and, you know, honors classes and dual enrollment classes and all those things, which are great. But for someone like me who was really struggling and did not have the slightest idea of what they wanted to do after high school, you know, when I was asked that question, I would usually just say the first thing that popped into my head because I could not physically fathom the idea of graduating high school because it terrified me. I was really terrified of the future. And that's something that fear of the future was consistent throughout my whole life, honestly. As long as I can remember, I've been frightened of the future. Still am to this day. That's what I needed validation from my mom a minute ago for. And so, you know, being in that type of, like I said, environment with, you know, school and the pressure of all of that, and then being a people pleaser and a perfectionist myself, the external pressures only added to the internal pressures that I was placing on myself. And so I was dealing with all of those things, but for whatever reason, never felt like what I was experiencing was worthy enough to seek help.
Wow. So you know, we've talked about a lot leading up to, and of course, some of the ramifications. But let's talk a little bit about that 2020 vision, looking back on, you know, the attempt, and then moving beyond that. Like, you know, how do you feel about? I know you're doing a lot of advocacy work now, and you're doing a lot to encourage people to, you know, help empower them so that they don't choose the same thing that you struggled with. But you know, what do you when you encounter somebody right now that might be contemplating or maybe in a place where they're just having a difficult time and they don't know, maybe put themselves back in your shoes where you were before. They're like, I don't know if I'm even having that, you know, this level of thought. There's people who have it so much worse than I do or whatever. You know, what do you what would you have told yourself prior to your attempt, and what do you tell people now to encourage them to not suffer in the same way you have?
Well, I think the number one thing that would have helped me to hear was that it's okay not to be okay. And that is the most simple phrase that we're actually hearing a lot these days, but it would have really made a difference because I thought that, you know, I have to be okay all the time. And if I'm not okay, then I have to figure it out and work on it quick and become okay. You know, and if I just knew that what you're experiencing is okay and you're normal, right? Like you're not crazy for feeling these things and you're not the only one. You're not alone as well. That would have been huge for me to hear because I was under the you know, impression that I was the only one that felt this way. And so in turn, again, I felt guilty for feeling these things. I felt shameful for feeling these things because I didn't understand why my peers and my friends could just be okay all the time and they had it all together. And yet I wasn't, and I never had it all together. And so had I just known that I wasn't alone and that it is okay not to be okay and that it's unrealistic to always be okay, and also that there is help out there because the lack of knowledge and resources was huge for me. Like I had no idea that right down the road there were resources and help just waiting for me to reach out. And so had I known, you know, those things, I think it really could have made a difference. And that's kind of what I like to tell people now is, you know, obviously everyone's circumstances are different. So, you know, it's situational on what advice you can give to someone. But overall, the advice that I like to give to everyone is it is totally okay and normal to feel this way. And because you feel this way, you should reach out for help and let people help you. Because, you know, I was under the impression that I was a weak person if I couldn't handle all my stuff on my own. And that's just not true. We were made for one another.
That's
we
right.
were made to help and support one another.
That's right.
So I just like to encourage people in that and just let them know that, you know, whatever it is you're going through, big or small, it has purpose and it's valuable, right? And you deserve to get the help that you need. That would have been really, really important for me to hear, I think.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that advice for the person who's in trouble. I also love that advice for the caregiver. Like all you're really saying right now is that if you see someone in trouble, validation and respect. That's what you needed.
Yeah. I think that, you know, because look, I'm not pointing fingers or blame at anyone because you don't know what you don't know and you can't help what you can't see. So, but when I would express, things. And like I said, the subconscious cries for help that I would leave on the table for my mom or dad, they were immediately obviously scared when I would express anything. And I never really expressed the depths of what I was thinking, but I expressed a little bit here and there. But their initial response was always to just fix the problem. Let's see what it is, fix it, and move on. And that would usually look like a quick little pep talk, and we'll move on about our day. And that was really damaging for me because that kind of gave me a false perspective of what help really was. And so, what they know now and what we all know now as a family is that validation and acknowledgement and just fully hearing the person, because we live in a day and age where everything is so fast paced. Everyone's always worried about the next thing they have to get to or the next thing they have to do. And it's like you never really sit down to actually hear someone. And, I feel like nowadays people are just trying to listen to respond and not listen to fully hear someone. And so if I would have just been fully heard and then in turn validated and not tried to be pushed towards a solution right away, and if I would have just been told, I hear you, that must be really hard. How can I help support you? Something like that would have been much different than, the feedback that I was given from who I, subconsciously was trying to reach out to.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah. I can't help but just having this conversation just makes me think so much about the, again, living with hemophilia. I mean, there's so many thoughts you're going through. There's so many things going on inside that everybody looks at me and goes, "Oh, you look like a normal guy. Like, what's wrong with you?" I'll give you some real crazy anxiety points for me that are probably seem so silly, but going into an event or going to a place or something where somebody might hand me a big box and say, "Hey, can you carry this inside?" If I know I'm going somewhere and that might happen, because I've had 5 surgeries on my right arm and 3 of them are elbow replacements. I'm not supposed to lift more than 5 pounds on it. But nobody knows that by looking at me. Mm-hmm. And so that may seem, I get sweaty palms thinking about it. I'm like, I can't handle that.
Do you put a sling on?
Okay, so I don't. But Carla and I have this discussion often about these things because she's like, you need to if you're going to a place that they just don't understand. But I sometimes will dress nice. Like sometimes I'll put on a suit and tie when everybody else is wearing shorts and T-shirts because I'm like, they're not going to ask me if I look nice. So it's silly things like that you think wouldn't give a lot of anxiety, but it's because I know that the perception from the outside looking in has no clue what I'm going through. And so I've had to come up with these little life hacks in a way that kind of say, okay, you know what? Let me just make it to where I don't feel weird and they don't feel weird. And maybe I had to put some thought into it ahead of time. But it is that idea that people just don't know what all is going on inside of your head and how. And I go back to, I don't think you can truly be honest with others until you can be honest with yourself. Mm-hmm. And so there is a place where, and we've talked about this some, Laura and I've had several conversations about this, like normalizing the conversation is so important to help with that. But then there's also the level that is still just kind of step one. Like once you've normalized it and you say it's okay to talk about it, then the question is like,
how do you talk about it?
Right. Like, what do you do now? And Lori's had some great resources and helpful things to do with, obviously there's a lot of resources for calling, the suicide intervention hotline and things like that. But it really does still all boil down to you being honest with yourself mm-hmm. and mustering up the courage mm-hmm. to speak up and say, I think I'm not okay. Mm-hmm. And finding somebody who's willing to listen to you in that place. Like, that's huge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's what, you talked about somebody just hearing you, just sitting down and listening and not giving advice and not trying to fix it. They're mm-hmm. just listening to you. And any resource that I think of, whether it's the suicide prevention hotline, whether it's a therapist, whether it's your best friend, they're listening. That's what I always tell people. Don't be afraid to offer the support mm-hmm. because really the next thing, the what next is just listen. Because most of the time that's just what people need. And I feel like a lot of times if you give people that space and that freedom to share and be open and honest, they kind of figure out the solution for mm-hmm. themselves. Mm-hmm. It's like little kids. We feel like they're little, they're vulnerable, they're not that, they don't have the emotional intelligence, they don't have the life skills. But then you ask them, what do you want? And they know exactly what they want.
Yeah.
Right? And so why can't we do that with a person who's just in a tough spot?
That's so good.
Listen to them and then ask them. And a lot of times they figured it out for themselves just because you helped them. You were listening.
Yeah, that's very true.
That's so true. So good. I think that there's a place too for people to. I always tell my kids this is like what you fear, you will have to face. Now that doesn't mean you have to go through it, but it does mean that you have to own it. You have to step up and say, you know what, I'm really afraid this might happen. And again, it goes all back to just being honest with yourself, to the end that you can also, be validated and have those respectful conversations with others, even about it to some degree. But, what I guess one question I would have too, and this is kind of to both of you, but is how do you handle it if you have the courage, you say something, and the recipient on the other side of it doesn't validate you? Like, what do you do with that? Like, let me phrase it. Maybe like, what is the appropriate response?
For the appropriate response
for the person who's trying to be vulnerable and they don't have a good person listening, hearing them on the other side. What do you do with that, Lori?
Well, you find another resource. The thing about reaching out for help is some people are truly incapable, and it's not always personal. Sometimes it's they don't have the skills. Sometimes the fear just overtakes them and they can't. But maybe they are the person with the messed up arm who just truly can't help in that situation.
Right.
And we don't always know that. It's hard to not interpret that as rejection. Sometimes it means something else.
Yeah.
But there's always somebody willing to listen. I always tell my husband, he'll pass by people and say, "Hey, how's it going?" And I tell him, "Don't ever tell that to people. Don't ever tell somebody, 'Hey, how's it going?' unless you're willing to sit down and listen to their problems for an hour." We kind of have to get out of this habit of cheap talk and and so I think a lot of times when it comes to caregiving, we kind of fall into that trap, like maybe that was the person, because I've had that happen to me where someone say, they catch me off guard and they say, they say hi and you say, "Hi, how are you?" And you just keep walking and you go, "Oh wait, they're still talking. I got to go back there and sit down and have a therapy session on the bench outside of the restaurant while my kids are screaming for food." But I say all that to say it is amazing where I've had therapy sessions in bars. I've had therapy sessions in bathrooms with people. It's just finding the right person. And there's always someone. I mean, the suicide prevention hotline is the number one place to go. It's about to get so easy. 988, in July, 988, you just call that number and it's.
Well, locally for Louisiana, there's a text line 211.
Right.
And that the same center answers those texts and calls. So I definitely would, recommend that if someone reached out and didn't get the response that they were looking for. But also, too, to kind of echo what Lori just said, do not let it discourage you. Because I've had to reach out to a couple people, that have tried someone and didn't really work, and then tried someone else, didn't really work, and then found someone who seemed to understand what I needed. So absolutely don't ever let it discourage you. If you reach out and you're being open and honest and vulnerable, and like if they're not giving you what you need or they're not receiving what you're sharing in a good way, find someone else, because like Lori said, there are always people who are wanting and able to help you.
That's really good. You said it earlier about, we were designed to not live alone. And I really believe this, that we were built to be in families. We were built to be tribal. We were built to be in community. And I think sometimes we misappropriate our bravery. I don't know if that's even a way to say that, but we sort of like, we're trying to be big and tough and strong. And, I know this is, as a guy, this is, my thing is that I should be able to do it. Therefore I'm gonna do it. And then I fail. And then I don't know what to do with myself when I fail. And so there's this whole like toughen it up kind of thing. And we're trying, it really is an act of bravery, but really if we use that same effort of bravery. It's probably even less effort of bravery to just speak up and ask a friend, or to, or to reach out for help from a resource. Like, that could be the thing that could be the game changer that could help unlock us. But I would say finding your people also plays a role in that. If you are in a toxic family, maybe you're listening to this right now, or you're watching and you're thinking, man, my family is toxic, my friends are toxic, everywhere I look is toxic. If you're in that situation, you said what you said just a minute ago is perfectly ideal. You said is keep looking, because your people are somewhere. Maybe you just haven't found them yet. And you've got to gravitate around this. One of the reasons why we do events is we do these online events, we do physical events, we do these events really to try to say, hey, especially around bleeding disorders, because it's so rare that you're going,
Here's your people. We're
here's your
handing them
yeah,
to you.
yeah. But the goal, and we talk about this all the time, is the goal is not just to find people that have the same diagnosis, but it's also about finding healthy community. Like, there's another whole layer to that where, I have a family and I have cousins and I have aunts and uncles. But if I'm not careful, sometimes those aren't the people that I always need the best advice from. And so I have to keep seeking the advice that will lead me in the direction that I know I should go in, even when I don't want to choose that. I know I need to go. So keep looking until you find, right?
Yeah, totally. And I say, no one is going to be able to advocate for you better than you. So you know what you need. But I definitely encourage, first step is to be honest with yourself and acknowledge what you're experiencing. And then have the courage, take the step to reach out for help. And again, if you don't get what you're looking for in the first try again, because there are 7 billion people on this planet.
Yeah.
You have people. They're, and that's what we tell when we present the film to, schools and things like that. We tell them, we hear often that, oh, I don't have anyone to talk to. Do you not have anyone to talk to, or do you just think that you don't have anyone to talk to? Right? So everyone has someone. You just may have to go out and seek them.
That's good.
I'm really big on prevention. And so even a step before that, I would say know who your people are before you even need them. Before you get in that spot where you're just at the hardest moment, know who those people are. And if you don't have them and you have to go out and search for them, sometimes talking to a stranger is so much easier than talking to the people that you see every day. Because they're not coming with preconceived notions. They're coming with judgment. They're a blank slate.
Yep.
You can just pour it on them, and they're just there to help you process.
That's so good. You mentioned the film. I know some people are watching or listening today and thinking about, man, I'd like to learn more about your personal story and your journey. There is a documentary that's been made about your journey and about your life, and I've seen parts of it. It's just really, really powerful story. Tell me a little bit about that and what the new project is that you're working on related to that.
Yeah, so initially after surviving my suicide attempt, I really felt a need and a calling. I don't know what it was. I think it was the Lord, but just to really share my story and to use my voice. And so I decided to start blogging, and I started a website where I was just writing out my experience and the things that I learned and everything that I've gone through. And then I published that blog on the internet, and then lo and behold, a filmmaker in the area reached out to me and wanted me to be a part of a panel that they were having for another suicide attempt survivors documentary film called Suicide: The Ripple Effect. It's a guy by the name of Kevin Hines who jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge and lived to tell the story. And so I was invited to be a part of that panel. And, it's interesting because I've always been biased towards thinking, not really biased towards action. But for whatever reason, I just jumped on it and said, yeah, I'll do it. And so that was the first time that I verbally shared my story with a crowd and an audience. And the response and the feedback that I got really gave me the courage to continue to share my testimony. And that same filmmaker that invited me to the panel approached me afterwards and said, I want to work with you. Let's make your story into something big. Let's make it into a movement to really spark this conversation and get people talking about the hard stuff. And so again, with that, I typically would have had to think it through, but I didn't. I just said, yeah, sure, let's do it. And we just started filming, and we started filming roughly a year after I attempted. So it wasn't even a full year after I attempted that I started sharing my story. And so the filming process lasted about 3 years. We wrapped filming in 2020. Obviously, COVID came and threw a monkey wrench and everything. So we kind of weren't able to do the initial release and premiere, but we were able to do a premiere in February of 2021 of the film in Baton Rouge, and it's called My Ascension, and we are currently offering community screening licenses. It was a really big goal, not only of myself, but the filmmaker as well, to not only make a great film that shares my story in a profound way and speaks to these topics that are not really talked about in the media or the mainstream, but also to make something bigger with it and really create more of an event style atmosphere. And so with that, we have been able to host screening events and do live Q&As after the events. And it's been a really cool experience to be able to utilize my story in that way. And so, yeah, if you want to check out more information on the film, it's myascension.us. And we have some goals and some hopes with the film. Currently, we're working on scoring some underwriters to be able to present on PBS this September. So that's kind of the next steps for the film. But it's been quite the journey, to say the least.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, I'm so excited that it's getting out there. I know that it might be seen a lot more broadly in a lot more circles. So make sure that you keep an eye out for that and get a chance to look at it. You can also go on YouTube and see the trailer. My Ascension, the movie, I think is the way to find that. But the website also has links to it as well. So I just want to say, two things. One is that I think it's inspiring to know that you face such tragedy and a miracle that you survived it. I mean, it's an unbelievable miracle that you survived. And to see how you've been able to use this as a platform to encourage others and to elevate the conversation it takes, again, I know we started this way, we'll end this way, is that it takes a tremendous amount of courage. So thank you so much for being willing to be transparent, not just for our community and for us today, but thank you for doing what you're doing in the broader community, because there's thousands upon thousands of people, maybe hundreds of thousands and even millions, that need to hear how it is possible for you to choose how to be honest with yourself, how you validate the concerns that you have and to speak up about it. And if we can have that courage first, well, I think we can prevent a lot of unnecessary suffering. And so thank you for what you're doing with that. And also thank you for sharing this with our community. I know a lot of people have struggled with mental health needs, and it's something that we're very committed to as an organization. And I'm excited about what the future looks like for elevating that conversation, normalizing it, but also helping to facilitate resources whenever necessary. And so I'm excited about what the future of that looks like as well. I would say this too. I know that you've got your own set of battles ahead of you too, because you're, for people who might be listening to this and haven't had a chance to maybe see the movie yet, know that you're in a wheelchair and you have some limitations. And so we welcome you into the chronic illness space and say thanks for being part of our community now. And we hope that whatever we can do to support you along the way as well, we want to be there for you, and anything that we can do to help you along your journey, we want to be there. So thanks so much for being with us today, Emma.
Oh, that was so, tearing up. No, that was so sweet. I really appreciate that. And people always ask me, is it easy to share your story? And I tell them one thing: no, it's not. But it's so worth it. It's so worth it because of the hope that comes from it, and of, just all of the good things that can come from me tapping back into that pain and kind of utilizing that pain and turning it into purpose. So I'm just so humbled and grateful to still be alive, first and foremost, but mostly humbled and honored that I get to sit at this table and do this type of work, because there is certainly a need. So thank you for asking me to be a part of your podcast and for welcoming me so openly into your community. Well, it means a lot.
Yeah. Well, just like the name on the sign, we have a lot of high hopes for your future, and we have high hopes for many people who are living with difficult circumstances to know that there is help. You just got to reach out. So thank you so much for being a part of the podcast today, and we'll hope to see you in the next one. Bye now.